Hi, my name is Shaelee Harper, and I will be presenting on miscarriages of justice in Canada, effects on Indigenous populations for Crim 416. Okay, so a quick overview before we get started. First, I'll be going over the background, then overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, miscarriages of justice, steps taken to fix the issue, and finish with media coverage. Okay, so since the creation of Canada in 1876, Aboriginal affairs including Indian status, land, resources, wills, education, band administration, and much more has been under control of the Canadian government. In the early creation of the Indian Act, the goal was to assimilate Indigenous people into the European culture. Traditional practices were also prohibited. Although some parts of the Indian Act have been changed over the years to reduce the harmful provisions, many people feel that very little has changed because it still erodes the cultural, social, economic, and political distinctiveness of Indigenous people. Between 1879 and 1996, Indigenous children were sent, sometimes forced, to attend residential schools, which is intended for them to lose attachment to their language and culture. The goal was to civilize and Christianize Indigenous children. The pain of children being away from their families was also made worse through disease, hunger, and various forms of abuse that they experienced while they attended these schools. The pain experienced by these children lasts and continues to be felt in today's generation and previous generations. The last school only closed in 1996. Many that attended throughout Canada are still alive today to tell their stories. The result of these schools created an immense amount of intergenerational trauma stemming in all aspects of their lives. This includes substance abuse and poverty, to name a few. In 2008, a formal apology was issued by Prime Minister Shaelee Harper for the various hardships that the children endured while they were in attendance of these schools. However, many Indigenous people feel that this came far too late. Overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. In a recent online news article by Chantel Bell-Richard, published by CBC, she states that the correctional investigator of Canada, Ivan Zinger, described the trend of increasing number and proportion of Indigenous people in federal prisons as disturbing and called for bold action and urgent action from corrections and the government. He further exclaimed that the indigenization of Canada's prison population is nothing short of a national travesty. This overrepresentation of Indigenous prisoners in Canada began at the end of the Second World War and remains a reality today based on scientific and statistical documentation. The data shows that the measures taken to combat this issue has not produced the desired results. Compared to other categories of accused individuals, Indigenous people are jailed younger, denied bail more frequently, granted parole less often, overrepresented in segregation and remand custody, and more likely to be categorized as a high-risk offender. Indigenous adults only represent 3% of the Canadian population, but are overrepresented in admission to provincial and correctional services. In 2015 and 2016, they accounted for 26% of admissions. Indigenous women represent 38% admitted to provincial and territorial custody, and Indigenous men represent 26% of those admissions. In federal correctional services, 31% were Indigenous female admissions, and 23% were Indigenous men. Okay. Miscarriages of justice. In an online news article by Tim Fontaine, published by CBC, Amanda Carling, who works with the Association in Defense of Wrongly Convicted stated that Indigenous people are not only more vulnerable to being wrongfully convicted, but are also less likely to get help once they've been convicted. It is also stated that Indigenous people are more vulnerable to wrongful convictions because of language barriers, mistrust of the legal system due to bad encounters of the past or just hearing experiences of their peers, and institutional racism. Some examples of cases where Indigenous people that have been wrongfully convicted include Tammy Marquardt, William Mullins Johnson, and Donald Marshall Jr. Tammy spent 13 years in prison after she was wrongfully convicted of second-degree murder for the death of her 2-year-old son in 1995. The conviction was based on evidence from disgraced pathologist Charles Smith, who was stripped of his medical license for misconduct and incompetence. Her 2 younger sons were adopted away because of her wrongful conviction. William spent 12 years in prison after he was convicted in 1994 on evidence from the same pathologist, Charles Smith, who suggested he had raped and strangled his niece. Mullins Johnson was exonerated by the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2007 after it was determined that his niece died from natural causes. Marshall was a Mi'kmaq man from Nova Scotia and was involved with one of the most high-profile wrongful conviction cases. In 1971, Marshall received a life sentence for a murder that was determined he did not commit and served 11 years in prison before he was exonerated by a royal commission in 1990 that determined systemic racism had contributed to his wrongful imprisonment. Okay, so steps taken to fix this issue. Bill C-41 was introduced in 1996, and it provided significant reforms to sentencing. The revised criminal code made provisions to sentencing and recognized the increase in the number of Indigenous people being incarcerated. The first main provision was the introduction of conditional sentences, and the second included the special reference to sentencing Indigenous offenders. Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code states that the sentencing courts must take into consideration all available sanctions other than imprisonment that are reasonable to the circumstances for all offenders, with particular attention to the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. This then led to the Gladue decision. The Gladue case was a landmark Supreme Court of Canada decision that advises that lower courts should consider an Indigenous offender's background and make sentencing decisions accordingly based on Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code. This was then reaffirmed and expanded upon the principles that were set out in the Gladue case in the Ipili case. However, the statutory requirements outlined in Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code are not being applied consistently across Canada, and many individuals are not receiving their right of proper consideration into their systemic background factors. The amount of information that is provided in a Gladue report also varies from province to province and might not be used because of the lack of proper information that may help the offender's case. A pre-sentencing report may be used as an alternative, but only provides a series of risk factors that are pointed out along with an Indigenous background, which may cause an unintended discriminatory effect that characterizes Indigenous people as high risk because of their circumstances as an Indigenous person. Further, Indigenous offenders are able to waive their rights to Gladue without knowing the circumstances. I noticed that a lot of media coverage that I looked at during this presentation, they don't always account for all of these details, like the vast past that Indigenous have with the Canadian government, and only focus on like the highly prolific cases and don't really give an accurate coverage to these various issues. Okay, effective media coverage. In a study conducted by Robert Harding, content analysis are used to analyze 90 news items about Aboriginal issues that appeared in the Vancouver Sun, the Province, and the Globe and Mail. This study builds on the research by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that concluded that their damaging stereotypes of Aboriginal people are perpetuated in all forms of public discourse, where they are labeled as victims, warriors, and environmentalists. The study found that the most primary topics covered by the news media are treaty negotiation / implementation, fishing and hunting, reserves, self-government, other land and water issues, and financial management. So even though that this study is kind of dated, I think it accurately represents what is going on in today's media, mainly because you don't see that many news media articles covering these issues. And I noticed that when they are covered, it is only highly prolific. Like the cases that I mentioned before, they were paid out a large sum of money in restitution for what they went through. And I think that there has to be this grasping, pulling in effect that has to be there for journalists to cover it, which shouldn't be the fact. I have this video here that accurately represents exactly what the gap in journalism that needs to be filled.
For me as a journalist at the Star Phoenix here, I've been lucky enough to cover a lot of Indigenous issues, and I've thought recently a lot about reconciliation and what that means for me as a journalist, and it means a whole lot of things, but it means learning about it myself and the issues, but it also means trying to educate the public about these issues.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission really brought out a lot of the facts about the hidden history of the oppression of Indigenous people and the genocide. And it's something that most Canadians didn't know about. Even a lot of Indigenous people weren't aware of the extent of the damage that had been done by the Indian residential schools.
I've learned a lot from you, but I've also learned how important it is for all journalists to learn about these kinds of things. And that's why I was really happy to hear that you and others were starting to organize this conference that we're going to hold next month. And as you say, a lot of journalists that are already working in the field haven't had a chance to learn about these issues in depth, and maybe this is one step toward helping journalists to reflect the issues and the history more accurately and a little bit better than we have in the past.
One of the people that we are going to feature at the conference that's coming up in October is Marie Wilson, who's a commissioner with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who for 6.5 years listened to the stories of the survivors of the Indian residential schools, and who will be able to give a really powerful talk about the effect that that had on Canadian society. The misinformation and the lack of information over lifetimes of Canadians needs to be backfilled with regular, consistent information. And that means that for a small story might require an extra few paragraphs, an extra few sentences to include some information to put things in a context, in a Canadian context.
Okay.
For me as a journalist.
Okay, so that was my presentation, and here are my references. Thank you so much for watching.